The studio machine is something that never stops moving. As massive media companies continue to grow through mergers and buyouts or finding themselves as a pawn of tech giants, the growing interest in franchising out the most successful films and shows, past and present, becomes bigger and bigger, especially as more options become available to the viewer day after day. Disney, being one of the titans of the modern industry, is no exception to this rule. In fact, a lot have followed in their footsteps, with how they really turned themselves around in the 2010s. We see them expanding beloved intellectual properties of the past and expanding on what has worked with Star Wars and Marvel, and reviving old properties through remakes of their classics and sequels. While the amount of decision making from the higher ups isn't information we're too keen on, Pixar, being a subsidiary of Disney since 2005, is a major player in the studio machine, creating some of the biggest films for the company both in quality and revenue, bringing in billions in merchandise alone year after year through the Toy Story and Cars series. There are many reasons why creatives and studio executives alike would wish to keep these film franchises ongoing. Even going beyond monetary gains, the characters and worlds are so rich, offering limitless potential for continuation. Throughout the 2010s especially, we saw many of these continuations at the feature-length level, with only Toy Story 2 predating in 1999. With the releases of Toy Story 3, Cars 2, Monsters University, Finding Dory, Cars 3, Incredibles 2, and Toy Story 4, there came a lot of criticism that the higher-ups had forced these upon the studio. Throughout the 2020s, they've stepped back on this quite a bit. We've seen higher film output, and only Lightyear has been tied to an existing IP, though Inside Out 2 and Toy Story 5 are still on the horizon. There have been increased efforts for brand continuation, however, with series like Forky Asks a Question, Doug Days, and Cars on the Road on Disney Plus, and occasionally we'll see shorts. This isn't new since we've gotten them from time to time since Mike's New Car on the Monsters Inc. DVD. Obviously, the films getting sequels from the studio are at the top of the list for this studio machine, with the series and shorts not too far behind. But what happens when Pixar doesn't have any plans for their legacy brands, but Disney sees fit for them on other verticals? This is something I want to look at today, as I'm curious to see the extent to how far these franchises can stretch, and if once they're gone, can they come back? I'll explain this one more a bit later. To lay some groundwork, I won't be looking at every instance of Pixar's brands being used externally, specifically just the times they were adapted to screen. Firstly, I feel like I have to mention the films that never were. Coming from Circle 7 Animation with Toy Story 3, Monsters Inc. 2 Lost in Scaradise, and Finding Nemo 2. These were all in development around 2004 to 2005, when Disney's deal to distribute Pixar's films was ending. Disney, still owning the rights to all the films that released under them, was planning on milking them with direct-to-video sequels, just like basically all of the Disney Renaissance. They created the aforementioned Circle 7 Animation Group, specifically for this purpose. And a decent amount of work was done on these films, especially their version of Toy Story 3, which has plenty of concept art with a lot of new characters. There's a lot of, I'll say, interesting ideas in here, and I may want to dedicate an entire video on them in the future. This alone makes me glad that Pixar stayed with Disney, since seeing these films release would have been at least a bit depressing for a lot of people, I can guarantee that. This does go on to set the precedent that Pixar or not, these brands can't sit around though. Throughout the 2010s, as I said, Pixar did go on to release a lot of sequels, though just as the decade was coming to a close, the launch of Disney Plus called for increased output. So the keys to the world of Monsters Inc. and Monsters University was given to Disney Television Animation for Monsters at Work. This series first aired almost 3 years ago, but you know the drill, spoilers if you care. Monsters at Work follows Tyler Tuskman, who has a job lined up at Monsters Incorporated after being top scarer at Monsters University. When he gets to work on his first day, shakeups are happening, with Laugh Power becoming the new focus for the company, so he is sent to the facilities team, where he tries to learn comedy so he can finally make it to the laugh floor. We mainly follow Miffed, Monsters Inc. facilities team, though Mike and Sully do actually play pretty big roles, and they are voiced by Billy Crystal and John Goodman, with part of the shakeups being them taking over the role of CEO. Now, I always figured this was entirely following the events of the first film, but the final scene in the last episode of Season 1 is in the epilogue of the original film, with Sully now having Boo's completed door. This means that this series, at least in the first season, is actually more of a midquel. There was a second season teased in the credits of the first that had job postings online, though nothing came of it until very recently. I honestly thought that maybe Pixar was wanting to make a sequel themselves, so any plans for a new season was going to be scrapped. But no, just development took a bit longer. I think the show is fine as is. The character animation leaves a bit to be desired, though it is impressive given the television budget. And I'll definitely check out the next season just to see what they decide to do with these characters. Though it has felt that Disney TVA are the sole providers for the brand now, with the monsters not even receiving a Pixar popcorn short. Of course, that's only one instance. It's far more likely that they didn't have any plans for the brand for the next decade, so they agreed to allow Disney TVA to do something with it. This one also at least has some Pixar employees creatively driving it in some regards, which is nice. It is just interesting to think about if Pixar did ever end up following up the property, specifically the events of the first film, like what we're about to see in season 2. Will we see any original series characters and continuity make their way over? My guess is no. It's a very hypothetical question, and perhaps a sequel takes place 30 years later, so it doesn't even matter. This does just get a bit fuzzy with another studio expanding on the film rather than a remake or reboot, which really isn't something I'd want either. Obviously, they wanted to include the likes of Mike and Sully for marketing and merchandising sake, and a lot of older fans will tune in for them, though they'd likely have more creative liberty with all new settings and characters at, say, Fearco or FearTech. But again, part of that is me not wanting the franchise closed off without stepping on toes in the future. Our next recycled brand, and the newest, is actually coming from National Geographic with A Real Bug's Life. This is an obvious play on A Bug's Life, using the same font, and it's the only use of the brand aside from Easter eggs in theme parks for 25 years. It's interesting to see A Bug's Life branding in something new, as only a couple years after A Bug's Land closed in Disneyland, this was announced, and it's releasing shortly after the other representation of the franchise at the parks, It's Tough to Be a Bug, was announced to be getting a replacement. I watched all 5 episodes, and it's your run-of-the-mill nature documentary. Each episode focuses on a different location where bugs can be found, going through a city, a jungle, a backyard, a savanna, and a farm, where we see different scenarios in which a few different bug species may go through on a day-to-day basis. Based on the premise of the show, I would have expected each episode to focus on one bug type, being the species we see in the film, like one episode for ants, one for grasshoppers, ladybugs, caterpillars, but this works fine for National Geographic. I just really don't think A Bug's Life branding needed to be brought in, because they didn't really do anything with it. Aquafina narrates, and she does a good job, but they could have got someone like Dave Foley or another voice actor from the film, and it would have been nice to hear some Randy Newman in there. I did catch 2 Easter eggs in the episode Braving the Backyard, with a Casey Jr. cookies box and a vintage flick toy showing up. There could have been more in the other episodes, but it is apparent that the film doesn't have any influence beyond those, which is kinda sad to see. Even though Bug's Life may not have the recognition it once did, I'd be surprised if the series doesn't have a lot more viewership than other, similar Nat Geo productions. This could probably go on for a few more seasons, and maybe, if synergy entices enough, they make a series around fish for a real Finding Nemo or Dory, though that brand is probably a higher ticket through the executive eyes of Disney, so perhaps not. Earlier I posed the question on if these brands can come back, and by that I mean back to Pixar. To answer that, we can look at 2022's Lightyear. Shortly after Toy Story 2 released, the pilot movie Buzz Lightyear of Star Command: The Adventure Begins released, which led into the full series Buzz Lightyear of Star Command. The movie and show were produced by Walt Disney Television Animation and chronicled the adventures of Buzz Lightyear and served the mythos of the character, while also giving insight to what Andy may have watched. There is a scene in The Adventure Begins animated in Toy Story CG fashion that was animated at Pixar to introduce the film, as they are credited as the co-producing studio. Though aside from that opening, it may be more in name only, since it's rumored that John Lasseter really did dislike the show. It's gone on to be buried in recent years with no appearances on Disney+. This could be due to Lightyear being in development at the time, however. The point is that the idea of Buzz Lightyear's origin and character at one time not being in their hands was able to come back as a feature film. You can say this happened when Toy Story 3 entered the fray, but it's quite evident that Lightyear attempts to capture the same essence, though perhaps to the dismay of many fans, it does it in its own way. I do love Lightyear, and I've said it before, but it's a topic for another day. And I'll say I think that both of these can realistically exist in the Toy Story universe if you're hung up on continuity. I just think that it's a really crazy look at the creative hierarchy of different studios all under Disney, which is something I could see a lot more of looming in the shadows. Disney could very well be telling Pixar to make Incredibles 3, or they'll just do a live-action remake of the first, especially since now The Incredibles has to advertise a premier attraction in Disney's California Adventure. Same thing goes for a lot of other films. The Cars franchise already got away from the Planes movies, which is something I'd hate to see the fate of the brand return to ever, as I feel the best case scenario for Pixar is letting them run how they see fit, and not driving around the brands to feed the studio machine, since the slope only gets more slippery as time goes on. Maybe I'm wrong, and all the creatives at Pixar would prefer these characters and brands to be used rather than stand on their legacies. Who am I to tell? That's about all I've got for this video. I went over a lot of different topics, but I think it's really important to look at, especially as Disney's desire to produce more grows stronger. I really just never want to have to see live action versions of Pixar movies, but what do you all think on the topic of recycling brands? I also have to thank you all for the absolutely tremendous support on the Cars 3 video. I really can't believe it. It's really got me wanting to make the best videos I can for you all. And I will say, in the process of making this, a real Bugs Life did get confirmed for our new season, and there's some talk about a real life Finding Nemo being a possibility, so there's that. Thank you all for watching all the way to the end, and as always, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.